Ghosts and ghouls, demons and aliens, monsters and worse. Only here on Ghost or What, the best channel for original scary stories. Our next story is Nightmare at Hospital. This story is from the time when I used to work in a hospital. I had completed my MBBS, and I was doing my house job there. I used to live in the hostel, which was 2 stops away from my hospital, so I had to take the bus. My duty was to start at midnight. I left my hostel at around 11:30 p.m. I stood at the bus stop and waited for the bus. It was not the first time that I was leaving for a late night duty, but this time, I kept waiting for 15 minutes but could not get the bus. I looked at my watch and realized that I would be late, so I started to walk towards the hospital. I was walking on the road. It was completely empty. I shivered, although it was not that cold. I kept looking behind me to see if any bus was arriving. Suddenly, I realized that someone was following me. I could not see who it was, as whatever it was, he was standing behind the shadows. I could see him clearly, but one thing that I noticed was that the person was wearing a hat. Several thoughts came into my mind, and I held my bag more tightly. I quickly went through my bag to make sure if I had the pepper spray with me. I looked behind to see that stalker again, but I could not see him. It was a 20-minute walk from my hostel to the hospital, and throughout those 20 minutes, I kept on checking if the stalker was after me, but I did not see him again. I let out a sigh of relief and entered the hospital. As I entered, I felt as if the hospital was too cold. It seemed deserted to me. I assumed that the duty person would be on a break or something, so I did not give it any attention and moved towards my department. I had my duty in the pediatric ward. As I entered the ward, I realized there were only 5 children admitted in the hospital that day. I quickly moved towards them and started to check their reports and their files. After I was done with my routine work, I went out of the ward and moved towards the common room of the doctors. The common room was at the end of the aisle, a little further away from the ward. I had to pass through the store to reach the room. As I walked past it, I looked at the store and it was dark inside and locked. I had never seen it open. They used to open it very rarely. I entered the room and made a cup of tea for myself and started to work on my assessment. Suddenly, I heard the loud cries of a newborn. I wondered where these sounds were coming from, and I thought that some other patient must have come in an emergency, as all the kids in the ward were above 8. I ignored it as I knew that the emergency staff must have come with them, and after some time, the sound stopped. After another 15 minutes, the crying started again. This time I could not stay in the room and went outside to check the patient. As soon as I stepped out of the room, the crying stopped. I was surprised, but I did not give it much thought and returned. But after some time, the crying was so loud that it seemed like the sounds were coming from outside. I quickly went out of the room, and to my surprise, the crying stopped again. At that point, I was a little scared as well. I almost ran towards the ward and entered just to confirm if there was any new patient, but there was not. I asked the nurse about a newborn child, but she shook her head in negation. I asked her if she had heard any crying, and she looked at me like she was considering me mad. I did not say a word after that and returned. But I could not build up the courage to go into that room again. But all my stuff was lying there, and I had no other option but to go. As I walked past the store, I felt something odd. I returned and looked at the store and realized that the door was locked, but the light inside was on. I shrugged off the feeling, considering that someone might have entered. I moved forward, but there were some strange sounds coming from the room. It was a mixed sound, like someone was singing a lullaby, but the person who was singing had a very weird and hoarse voice. Suddenly, the lights inside the room went out, and I could feel my legs shivering. I quickly moved away from the store and hid behind a door. I was making sure that the room was in my view. As I was standing there, I saw the door opening, and then I saw a dark shadow coming out. I waited that after the shadow, the person will also come out. But whoever it was, he never did. It was just a shadow walking in the corridor, and it was wearing a hat. Suddenly, I remembered the stalker. At that point, I was quite sure that whoever this was not a human. I felt my legs trembling, and my hands were sweating. My heart was racing and my throat went dry. I could not understand anything, but I knew I had to stay silent. I had my hand over my mouth, when suddenly the door opened again. This time I could see more than a shadow. A woman stepped out of the store. She was carrying a baby in her arms. As she stepped away from the store, the door got closed on its own. I could not believe my eyes. Suddenly, that woman turned around, and what I saw was something quite horrible. The woman had big black eyes, and there was no white part. Her teeth were quite long and were coming out of her mouth. Her eyes were dripping blood, and I felt that I would faint. And the baby looked like a mixture of a pig and a human. His head was that of a human, but the remaining body was of a pig. That was the limit for me, and I screamed loudly and fainted. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself lying on the bed. I asked what had happened, and they said that I was found inside the store, and I was suffering from high fever. Everyone asked me what I was doing inside the store and how I even entered. I told them about everything that I saw and that happened to me, and they all became surprised. That was the only time that I came across something like this. I still remember the trauma that ended for several weeks, but after that incident, I never used to stay alone in the hospital. Did you think that was the end? The terror never ends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more horror stories, only on Ghost or What.